Today's conversation is about a shift that's already happening, whether we've planned for it or not. AV is no longer a standalone system sitting quietly in a room. It's now a network-dependent, security-sensitive, business-critical workload. But many AV environments are still being designed using network models that don't scale, don't satisfy IT or security teams, and create long-term operational challenges. The gap between how AV operates today and how it's still being designed is what drives many of the issues we'll discuss today, from configuration mistakes, security concerns, IT pushback, high support costs, and many more. So today we're going to focus on one core question. How do we design AV networks that IT can trust, that AV teams can support efficiently, and the organizations can scale confidently in 2026 and beyond? So as we know, a lot of issues customers are struggling with today don't come from bad devices, but they are coming from early network design decisions. So Michael, what are the most common network configuration mistakes you're seeing today when AV is deployed at scale?
I would say the most important one is the inconsistent and traffic segmentation. Also, especially now, as we were just saying as well, as Jeff and I were saying, the isolation of an AV network from the enterprise networks really doesn't allow scaling. So if they still isolated, the integrator cannot really manage it remotely. And I would say helping that, I would say putting things into place where remote management can be done and where you are able to support your customers and end users better, it is going to be it helps addressing a lot of network issues. I would say with that as well, Jeff, that's probably also a lot of the common pain points that you face when you have your customers using the software from Utelogy, right?
Yeah, and it's very much, I think, to a multifaceted set of challenges, right? Because you have the challenges or problems that it creates, but I also think you need to explore why. And that's an equally, in my mind, almost maybe even more important side of the conversation, right? Because for so long, to your point, Michael, a lot of the AV devices, AV equipment, what have you, have been put on these very physically isolated networks, right? So a physically isolated, yes, network switch in a room with physically isolated everything. And, it creates those challenges that you mentioned, right? It creates no visibility to those devices, right? It allows for no management of those systems and all of these other things. But I think that the question to be asked is why has that been done, right? And in a lot of instances, I think there's multiple reasons that explain why that's been done. But I think in a lot of scenarios, it happened because no one ever took the time to have the appropriate conversation about why it was important, like what the actual value was to the end customer and in putting those things on the network, right? And also they weren't involving the appropriate stakeholders, right? They weren't always necessarily involving the customer's enterprise networking team, right? So it was oftentimes easier to just simply take and deploy AV as an isolated system in the room off of the corporate network, because then you could circumvent, having an InfoSec conversation. You didn't need to have and engage with the enterprise networking team and all these other things that had to fit in, as a result of the fact that no conversation had ever been had about what the value of doing so is, which is precisely what we're going to be talking about today, right? Mm-hmm. Today, we're going to be talking about and exploring the why behind it. Why should you, because it is extra work, right? This isn't, I don't want to say it's much easier than it used to be, but it still requires some amount of time and commitment on all these other things to do this properly. And we want to illustrate the why, just as all of these other technologies have done, right? This has been done in telephony. This has been done in security. This has been done in all of these other areas. And so now we're going to explain why it should be done and needs to be done in AV.
Yeah, and I think, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think, and on top of that, it's definitely also a kind of a learning curve because traditional AV wasn't digital. Now everything is starting to become digital. A lot of times that we work with our integrators and end users, they know the AV side very well, but doing the IT side it came as an afterthought, as you said, right, Jeff?
Mhm.
And we do, from our, at least from our standpoint at Netgear, we really help with that, and from start to finish, and also kind of educating our customers on the best practices, and why you do certain things in certain ways. Like as an example, we've had recent discussions with new designs where we see it a lot more, where it isn't an isolated design anymore, and where the IT teams, and
Mhm.
especially large scale enterprises, they need that visibility.
Yeah. And I
Yeah,
think,
so
go ahead.
treating and some of the stuff that you guys touched on a little bit, but that I want to dive into more is when you do isolate the AV networks, there is a lot of pain in the organization,
Hmm.
especially from the security side, from the troubleshooting side, how AV and IT teams can support this. So if we can talk a little bit more about how these decisions are really hurting and impacting organizations, I think that would be some really great insight for you to share.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to start, Jeff,
Yeah, feel
well,
feel free to lead it
Sure.
off.
Yeah.
perfect. So I would say probably the biggest one is like the one we mentioned on top, right? Traffic problems. If you don't segment things correctly, and this is probably also one of the discussions that we have, I would say time and time again. And a traditional IT team, they're not very aware of how multicast works. Multicast is not really in the IT segment. Multicast is definitely in our segment, because without multicast, our AV requirements wouldn't work. But if they always think, okay, there's AV here, it's gonna flood the IT network, it's gonna break things, and that's something that we're trying to overcome with yeah, how we help our customers, how we help the IT teams. And I would say that's also especially important when we need security. Like security
Mhm.
nowadays is probably just as important as anything else. It's probably actually even more important than anything else. So and with that, I would say, Jeff, the software and hardware that comes into play for getting this all done correctly is definitely one of the key points as well.
Yeah, well, and it's really interesting too, because you both touched on this a little bit, right? We have seen things get better in the last several years with, more customers, I think, being open to having a conversation about, putting AV on the enterprise, corporate network, if you will. But the other scenario that I've seen play out as a result of that is some customers have done precisely that, but maybe not in the best or most appropriate
Hmm.
way. And I've seen some scenarios where maybe, for instance, you were talking about multicast traffic, and they take all their AV and they create a single, what they call AV VLAN, and then they slam all of it into that one singular VLAN. And that's including, multicast video streams, multicast Dante audio or AES 67 streams, along with control, along with digital signage, content delivery, along with UC devices like Teams or Zoom room systems. And they put all of that into a singular AV VLAN without segmenting those different multicast traffic types or the different content
Hmm.
types. And that leads to a separate set of problems. And so one of the things that we've also seen is, if customers have gone so far as to being willing to adopt this idea and move forward with it, if not done properly, then we face a separate set of challenges, which is we go to try and have this conversation with them kind of a second time to say, hey, let's do this, but they're gun shy, right? Because they've been burned in the past because they tried to do it not
Yeah.
implemented properly, and it created so many of these other pitfalls that you see mentioned here, right?
Well, definitely, and just as you were touching the villain structure, yes, we also see that a lot, where everything is combined. It's like, okay, I have two or three switches or one switch, and it's not that difficult to manage everything in one VLAN, and where sometimes we would actually go in and say we'd probably be better off factory defaulting everything, reconfiguring it correctly, and spending a half day as opposed to keep troubleshooting it, needing to go on site and or calling NETGEAR or opening a support ticket where obviously you have to wait, right? And things aren't always resolved very quickly.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, I think of all the, the slides that we have today, if you will, I think this is really one of the more important ones because it touches on not only the challenges or why this hurts organizations, but the things that you're missing out on as well. I know, later in the presentation, we're going to be talking about the solution and, the benefits that provides you. But this is really important here, right? Even things like enforcing security policies and compliance standards. And I do want to take a second to talk about that because we've seen, again, these scenarios where things get put on an isolated AV network with the idea or done on the basis that, okay, if I put it on a physically isolated AV network, it's not on the corporate, then it doesn't have any security implications and it can't hurt the other things. But, and some of these are corner cases, I'll give you that. But I have seen, vulnerabilities in products where something's got a Wi-Fi chipset in it or a Wi-Fi card. And even if that device is on a physically disparate isolated AV network because it's got a Wi-Fi chip on it, it's sitting next to the customer's corporate network. If there's a particular vulnerability that exists and you haven't patched it because you haven't done firmware updates to your devices, that creates other inherent risks. So I think this idea or concept that, I put it on a physically isolated network in the customer's environment completely 100%, isolates me, maybe the integrator, or the customer from having any other security implications isn't always 100% accurate, right? And so what we want to do is empower the customer to have not only all of the other benefits and remove some of these other challenges, but have the security benefits that come along with that as well. And just one final thing, because I see and hear this every day. Again, this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. Just the time and effort that it takes to support some of these systems if you don't do this, right? Again, that example that I just used, needing to do a firmware update to a device. It could be for a couple of reasons, right? Maybe you want to do a firmware update because there's a security vulnerability that you want to patch, but we're seeing too, with the advent of, not the advent, but with the enhancements that are coming along in software, even with older hardware, there's a lot that can often be done. So a new firmware version comes out for a particular device. There could be a lot of additional functionality and features that you get that come along with that. And if you have all these physically isolated, disparate systems, and you have to send a physical human being to 100 or 1,000 rooms to update firmware on a room-by-room basis, device-by-device basis, the time and cost associated with doing so is immense.
Yeah.
Some degrees almost maybe not even measurable, right?
And that seems super reactive too. There's no proactivity involved whatsoever. Potentially a lot of downtime for sites if they have to take stuff off the network. That seems pretty poor.
Yeah, and just having regular maintenance schedules and because now that AV is going more to over IP, the users really need to think of this. Again, bugs and open issues that are outstanding that aren't really being taken care of because it's been running, and then that's the question that we also, or an answer that we also get, right, Jeff? Where they say, but why would I need to do this? It's been running fine for 2 years. It's still good practice to keep it updated.
No, I mean, I've heard that more times than I could count in my experience working in this industry, where a system gets deployed onto a physically isolated system or network. And, I had, I think, a meeting 2 weeks ago or maybe it was 3 because it was right before ISE, where I asked, when was the last time this system had been updated, right? When was the last time firmware updates had been done to these devices? And they're like, I don't know, 5 years ago when the system was deployed, right? Because it was just kind of set and forget to a certain degree. And I remember we were having a conversation about a particular device, and there was like 3 really cool benefits that customer would have received from doing those incremental, firmware updates to those devices. Forget about all the other things, right? The visibility, the monitoring, the management, the ability to do all these automated workflows. And I think it's kind of probably a good segue to talk about the benefits of doing it the right way, which I know we're moving into. But Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is a perfect segue. And we've talked a lot about some of the bad stuff and how things aren't great, but I think we have some good news that we want to talk through, and that all of the problems and challenges that we talked about are solvable. And if we go back to the question that we opened with, how do we design AV networks that IT teams can trust? Where do these solutions start? Michael, if you want to talk into a little bit more about what does the right network approach look like, and how we can, start solutioning these and providing some of that
Yeah.
benefit.
Well, as an example, it's also I would say the initial conversation should be had with all the right stakeholders. Often, again, we do this very often in our team, and network might run very well, but then there is no afterthought. Okay, what are we expecting in the future? How are we going to make the network better? Um, and then we all know that when we have clients that we work with today, they might say, okay, we only need A, but then in next month or next year we need B, C, and D. So having these conversations early on, where we have segmentation, where we really think of, okay, how do we do our VLANs? What is the layout of our network? What might be the bandwidth in the future? What security implications do we have, and how can we implement this together with the IT
Mhm.
teams? So as an example, we recently I had a customer meeting where some of this wasn't actually implemented. And again, what we usually do at NETGEAR is, if it's not done very well, it's probably easier for us to say, okay, you know what, let's take out a half day. Let's just think about what we need to do. And then I can help you, or our team can help you reconfigure it. And then with that, we often have some cloud options where certain software, like we just discussed before, right? Functions are not always needed, but they're very very useful. And maybe today we don't have this function on our software, on our hardware, or on your software, where in a year's time they do. And so just keeping these things into place is very important, and especially now with large scale enterprises. And separate AV islands isn't really a desired network, right, Jeff?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, you just touched on so many things that I violently agree with, right? And it's so important. I think if there's any one singular thing, gosh, there's so many things that I want people to take away from this conversation today. But if there's one singular thing, probably more than any other, it's to make
Mhm.
sure that you're involving the appropriate stakeholders, the appropriate people in these
Yes.
conversations, right? I know one of the bullets that we had on like the first slide, I think, was, historically a problem has been is that we haven't engaged or always engaged with the right stakeholders, right? And making sure that the customer's enterprise networking team is involved in those conversations, because even if you think you've got it all covered, right? There is a whole team of people that are responsible for ensuring, the security and the scalability and all of the other aspects of these networks and these systems that they're responsible for on a day-to-day basis. There might be some little aspect that you never accounted for that they're aware of, right? Making sure that you're having the right conversations with the right people is so immensely critical to this generating a positive outcome, right? And
Yeah.
if you do
And
nothing else, do that. Make sure that you're engaging the customer's networking
Mhm.
team or their consultant or whoever the appropriate parties might be, to make sure that you've got visibility and buy-in from everyone,
Yeah.
right? So,
and but that also ties in what you just said before, right? That where there's a lot of cost involved in incorrect
Mhm.
configurations, incorrect networks, and it's gonna take them more time to actually work on things that aren't done well, just to
mhm.
to rectify them, than once they have the discussion and then all the right stakeholders are there.
Yeah, and it might not always be a frictionless conversation, right? There
Mhm.
may be some difficult conversations that you need to have to,
Mhm.
again, explain the value in what you're doing, right? And why it needs to be done. But if the appropriate conversation is had with the appropriate people, albeit maybe sometimes slightly difficult, the outcome is way better than if you're trying to backpedal and talk about the problems that you're facing because it wasn't done appropriately or the correct way from the beginning, right?
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, and it's fantastic that we have all these solutions. I also want to make sure that we talk about what does implementing these properly, maybe having those longer conversations up front, even if it seems more daunting at the beginning to not have those conversations and rework at the end. But what are we enabling? What benefits are these solutions enabling for customers doing this?
Yeah, and I'm happy to delve into this one for sure.
Yeah.
I know Michael's gonna like talking to you all about, what this looks like in practical terms, but in terms of what you're gonna get from this, it's all those things that we've been talking about, right? So now you've got visibility. If you've got, AV devices that are physically isolated and you have no way to communicate with them, you have zero visibility aside from somebody physically walking into a room to understand that.
Mhm.
For a large global enterprise, that's just not going to work and it's not going to scale, right? So
Mhm.
having global visibility across your entire estate, for not just your UC devices, but your AV devices. One of the things that I also frequently talk about is I think there's a common device that frequently gets overlooked in this conversation, and I'm going to say it here because I think it's important enough. If we had a conversation 10 years ago about you walking into a conference room or a meeting space or something of that nature, what the one common device or piece of technology would have found was, and it probably would have been some type of conference phone, right? It might have been like one of those poly, star phones, right? Or something like that. And I think now today, if you walk into any meeting space, again, if you will, huddle room, conference room, what's the one common piece of technology you're going to encounter? It's probably going to be some type of a display device, right? So, it's going to be a display, TV, projector, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter if you're a Teams house or a Zoom shop or you got, BYOD or even maybe an HDMI cable hanging down from a display. There's probably some type of display medium, some type of display device in that room, and getting those things on the network is going to further enhance and enable your visibility across the estate. So we're big proponents of making sure you get those display devices on the network as well. These things are going to lead to our ability to not only just give you insight as to the status of these devices and scenarios, but it's also going to enable all of the automations that come along with it, right? At Utelogy, we frequently state that we're not even a software company, that we're a workflow company, right? Yes, we are a software publisher at the end of the day, but we spend 90% of our day talking about workflows, much like you do, Michael, and kind of what you've alluded to, right? And so
Yes.
talking about the problems the customer's having and how we're going to solve them through automation, and not just saying, hey, there's a problem on a dashboard, but actually being able to do something about it, right? And being able to take action through automation, whether that's self-healing a display that's on the wrong input, or making sure that a device's firmware is up to date. All of these things are what get enabled as a result of taking an enterprise approach to the deployment of these systems.
Yeah, and I want to just add to that as well, where these solutions all and especially like your software and enable users to work quicker towards an issue that is ongoing and solving that, where our switches really then also add to that it's easier to configure. And then when it's easier to configure, it's also easier to troubleshoot because it's just not that difficult to look at the configs or look at the settings. And if everything is done right, then yeah, the time spent on a small issue is a lot shorter than the time spent on a small issue when it's not done right from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we're going to be exploring now some, again, what this looks like in practical terms. I do want to make this statement as well, because there might be, even if there's only one person today that watches this and has this thought, there will probably be someone who says, okay, well, this is maybe a little self-serving for Utelogy and NETGEAR, right? That, okay, we're having this discussion, and certainly if you put your devices on the network, particularly if you put your devices on a NETGEAR switch and you're using Utelogy for monitoring, that it's self-serving to us who are all here today in some purpose. And though that there's probably, well, there is a level of truth to that, certainly. Here's what I would say to that. I would have this very discussion and feel this strongly about these topics, even if a customer were to look me in the eyes and say, I'm a Cisco shop and I never intend to use Utelogy, I would say all of these same things. And I feel this strongly about all of the points that we're covering here today and why it's important to the customer and the value that it provides them. So certainly, yes, I'd love it if everyone was using Utelogy. I'm sure you probably feel equally strong about everybody using NETGEAR, but using whatever solution you might be using, this is going to empower long-term value and scalability regardless of the products.
Yeah.
Yeah. And especially just putting the right measurements in place for the right requirements. And as you said, Jeff, it's not just NETGEAR, it's any switch, obviously, that you can make it work. And the way they do it, that's up to the end user and I would say IT teams where these discussions often come into place. But yeah, this is probably one of the most important requirements. If it's not done right from the beginning, if you don't have this visibility, it's going to be very hard to work with it in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've talked about challenges, we've talked about solutions and how we can get there. And Jeff, I think you made a comment a couple slides back on, good design only works if the responsibilities are clearly defined, also shared amongst the team, and the teams are having those proper conversations. So I think that's really important for all of this implementation. But we also want to make sure that we're talking about best practices. So Michael, if you're able to discuss and walk us through a little bit more around best practices, trunk versus access ports, VLAN strategies, maybe diving a little bit further into security policies, kind of before we start showing some of those visuals and how we do it, let's just have a little conversation on what those best practices do look like.
Yeah, so well, let's start with the basics, right? Because this is where a lot of confusion happens especially for integrators that aren't, or end users that aren't very IT savvy. Because let's face it, users that come from the AV world like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was a lot different than what we see now. And with technology, everything is so rapidly evolving and increasing that things change very quickly. But a trunk port is kind of a port that connects two devices together, but it's only two devices or more devices that talk to each other in a network language. And where an access port is always going to be your end port. Now, access ports or the access port settings should only be added or set to devices in a particular VLAN. But the issue is where often there's an kind of a combination of configuration errors, user errors, or knowledge errors. The separation of responsibilities that we're discussing now isn't always being thought out. So like we said before, right? We have one VLAN and we just put everything on there, just like we do at home. We have one IP scheme and it's not being discussed with the IT team. So putting these thoughts into place where we're going to put several VLANs, maybe 4 or 5, not making it too hard. Sometimes we go users that we see, each room has its own VLAN, has its own configuration. That's also not a good thing, but having these thought out practices in place before they do the design and network. This also really helps with really reducing the troubleshooting requirements. Once it's all done correctly, if there's an issue, it's really easy to find. And with that said, with enterprise networks, you can easily implement security features like radius and other technical requirements. So you can block ports as long as you do these things correctly. And that's where I think I'm very passionate about, sometimes maybe a bit too much. And I spend too much time on it. It's like you especially from an IT background, it's like, oh, actually, but then you don't think like an end user or somebody that I work with, they don't know all the terminology. So sometimes it's also good to just get back to the customer's level and make sure that they understand it. Yeah, I think, and maybe you have something to add here for me, Jeff, or how you feel about this.
Well, also, as I've already articulated, right, very passionate, a subject I'm very passionate about. I think, and this is something that I've heard come up quite frequently, right? So maybe one of the objections that we'll hear in this whole process is, okay, well, if we involve the right stakeholders and we have the right conversations and we get the buy-in to do it the right way and put everything on the network, then that creates this massive additional burden to the customer's networking team, right? And what I like that we've highlighted here is this clear separation of responsibility and actually being able to reduce the burden on the networking team. Because if we've done this right, and if we've done it in a way that aligns to the customer's wishes, desires, needs, etc., this can be done in a way so that you do have a separation of responsibility. So if we've got the network designed in a way where, let's say, we're using, trunk ports for multiple VLANs appropriately. So maybe from like an IDF, and I don't want to get, I know we're kind of doing VLANs 101 here today a little bit, but if we're coming from like an IDF, which is controlled by the customer's networking team, they control the switching infrastructure and the MDFs and the IDFs, these main switch closets, if you will. They get to designate and decide which, so you're going to agree to what VLANs are going to be created. They're going to get to control what goes out of the switch port off that trunk port in those closets, right, and lands into the room. But because they've done that and because they have that layer of security, then they could also reduce their burden by assigning the access port assignments and the work to do that to the managed service provider or the AV integrator, right? So it doesn't have to be an additional burden to the customer's networking team, right? There can be that delineation and responsibility. Certainly, yes, if the networking team wants to own that and wants to not only do the trunk port associations, but also all the access port associations or, any number of other things, they can do that. But because we have this deployed appropriately and in a way that makes sense at scale in an enterprise way, we can, delegate some of that work out to other parties to reduce that burden to the customer.
Yeah, and I think, well, especially now, 2026 and onwards, you're going to have these requirements a lot more. Where, and it comes back to everything that we discussed before. If things are thought out correctly, it reduces problems, it reduces problems to the solutions, and also, like you said, the responsibility is in place to the right teams. And that combination of it allows IT and AV to really integrate together.
100%.
Should we talk a little bit more about preferred AV network design patterns?
Let's do it.
All right. Michael, if you want to kick this off.
Yeah, so here we see really a desirable network where we have an MDF on top, a core switch, our IDFs, and then a distribution switch in each meeting room and our endpoints, right? This is how we would like to see it. Sometimes this is not always how we see it and how it's done. So again, going back into conversations before we implement the networks is really important because one, we have issues with bandwidth, the integration towards the IT network isn't there, and it's not scalable. And what we see here is an intentional network. It's thought out. It's definitely scalable because maybe we thought of, okay, next year we're going to do this. In the year after, we're going to expand so far. And with that in mind, we can then also really easily implement security. We can think of all the requirements, and that's not an afterthought because everything has been discussed with all the right teams.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing that is important to highlight is, we're obviously discussing things in broad terms here today, right? So though there are concepts that should largely apply to many or all customers, I think we also recognize that no two networks are completely identical, right? And that there are certain, differences that will occur from, one environment to the next. So, I just want to be very cautious in some of this here today, because your network may look a little different than this, but what we're going for here and what we're driving at is the concepts, the general concepts of all this, right? And I don't expect everybody watching this to know that, MDF is main distribution frame and what an IDF is, or, edge versus core, or all those things, but to kind of understand that, again, if we're doing this the right way, we're doing it in a distributed, scalable architecture in a way that best serves the needs of the customer, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and with that, I would say, and again, I'm talking from a NETGEAR standpoint here, but we really help. Like if we have users that contact us, or maybe contact you, and then you refer them to us because it's a network issue, and it's maybe not. It's something that we would have to deal with. We really try to help educate the customers because. Once they are educated, when a customer or our users or everybody that is watching this, if you just know how to do things in a better practice and in a better design, it's really going to help grow towards the future with all our networks. And sometimes you see daisy chain switches. It might work at the beginning, but it's not very scalable. And I think the scalability is probably one of the most important aspects in AV over IP because we work with a lot of multicast video, and incorrect configurations can break everything.
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So on the education path, and Jeff, I know earlier you mentioned VLANs 101. It's probably pretty important that we dive into that a little bit. Explain to our watchers a little bit more about VLANs. We have a little graphic for you guys to watch.
Yeah, and I think, I do want to say this one time more. Please, proceed with caution in this and understand that no two networks are completely identical, right? So these are some kind of broad recommendations, if you will, or maybe even generalizations, if you will. But there's a meeting that I conduct every couple of weeks. And I start that meeting off by saying, okay, now make sure you use 4 VLANs for all your deployments, one for your control, one for your UC devices, one for your, multicast video, one for your multicast audio. You may have customers that don't have multicast audio or Dante. Maybe they want to plan for it. Maybe they might in the future. You might have some customers that don't have any type of digital signage content delivery. So, this just goes back to what we said earlier, which is involve the right stakeholders and have the right conversation, because these things will shake themselves out, right? In terms of how many VLANs might be appropriate for you. And I think the other thing that this highlights is certainly in this example, we show 4 VLANs, right? One customer, this might just mean 4 VLANs. Another customer, it might mean 4 VLANs per building, or per campus, or per region. There's a lot of different ways that this one concept can actually play out in the real world, right? And this is a starting point, but the thing that we're trying to highlight here is that VLANs enable you to segment that traffic. That's kind of the overarching part here. And how we can do that with, trunk ports and access ports and everything else. And so, Michael, I'm sure you probably have some ways that you want to expand upon that.
Yeah, and I would say in this regard, it's really important for our customers and definitely our viewers here is don't go beyond like where you want to separate things, right? Especially with the AV traffic. For instance, we know Dante needs to be, well, preferably it would really be on its own network. And one of the reasons is if you mix things in together, audio is very sensitive to packet loss. So from a technical standpoint, if you don't separate that out correctly, and we add video, then we add our UC traffic, and we're also going to add our management. If we don't separate these things out, audio might work at the beginning, but then everybody's in the office. We have an all hands meeting. If everybody's watching, and then suddenly audio is delayed with like 5 seconds or just mutes, because with Dante it's pretty good from a protocol standpoint in how it deals with certain delays in the network. But there are other protocols that don't handle that very well. Like AES67 is if time syncing isn't there and isn't correct, they will just mute. So putting these practices into place and putting the right VLANs into place from the beginning, again, this comes back to what we discussed before, that it resolves issues, it reduces problems in the future, and it just allows our users to make sure that everything runs smoothly. Because the combination of is often a bad recipe, or it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, well, and I think there's some real world examples that I'd like to leverage, or at least some conversations that I've had that I think are important to expand upon this topic. Because I know here we might have some people that are viewing this that, aren't as savvy with VLANs or don't have much experience working with multicast traffic. And so just to break it down a little bit further, for instance, so multicast traffic, and that we'd have a separate 2-hour conversation on that, if not more. But multicast traffic is a means by which devices can subscribe to a stream, if you will, right? If not implemented properly, though, and I'm trying to say this in the most generic terms that I possibly can, if not implemented properly, multicast traffic is, for all intents and purposes, really broadcast traffic, right? So if you don't have your IGMP snooping and querying set up, what that means to somebody who's not familiar with VLANs and is not familiar with multicast traffic is, if you have a multicast audio or video device on your network and it hasn't been implemented properly, it is going to, what they call, flood that entire network, right, that it's a part of. And so it's just going to broadcast out, it's going to flood a bunch of traffic. And, one of the arguments that I've heard before, I was having a conversation, I think a couple months back, and someone was telling me, well, okay, well, I isolate, or I do a VLAN per room. And one, I would say, if you're doing a large enterprise deployment, that's going to run out of scale really quickly, because if you've got thousands of rooms under management, no one's going to want 1,000 VLANs. But the other problem that creates in a scenario like that, and I think these specific examples are good, is let's say you've even got an environment where you've only got 20 or 50 rooms, right? And let's just imagine, if you will, for a moment, that you did do a VLAN per room, which typically wouldn't recommend in most or any scenarios. But let's just say that happened. If you have both multicast video traffic and Dante audio on that same switch, and one of those devices, or that switch isn't, well, one, the switch isn't configured appropriately, or the devices aren't configured, you could have maybe your video multicast set up appropriately, but maybe you got clock skew or a master clock issue with your Dante. Now that creates a separate issue. And because they're all on a singular VLAN and you haven't segmented that traffic, even on that one single switch in that one room, that can create issues within just that one environment, right? So,
and also, to add to that, Jeff, is if we have every room has its own VLAN, every classroom has its own VLAN, or office or boardroom. If you want to send traffic back and forth, it's going to be really difficult to configure from a network standpoint. It's
not almost impossible.
It's a nightmare. Yes.
Yeah.
So again, thinking about what you do in the future and what you do now, it's important. It doesn't scale if you don't do it right.
Yeah, I mean, another argument I've heard is, I had somebody say to me one time, well, Dante is unicast by default. And that's a true statement. Dante traffic, Dante devices in 99.9% of instances are unicast by default, right? It's like a point-to-point type scenario, but it can be configured for multicast. And so the challenge is, even if you've got an environment where you've got a bunch of Dante audio devices, and let's say you've got, let's use a random number, let's say you've got 10 of them, and 9 of them are configured for multicast or unicast, but just one of them, maybe somebody accidentally checks a check mark or modifies a configuration parameter, and that device is now set up in a multicast mode. Again, that one scenario, even if you had, because if you had planned on all of that traffic being unicast and you didn't set up your network appropriately to deal with multicast traffic, and now you get that one rogue configuration from that one rogue device that's configured in multicast, it's now flooding that entire network, right? Even if it's just a singular switch, it's now flooding that entire network, that broadcast domain, with all that traffic. And so it's just imperative to have the right conversations and to do this in the right way.
And I would also say, and to add to that, is we can buy smart switches, unmanaged switches to do some of these functions. And but it's probably better to spend a little bit more and to buy a managed switch that allows you to actually set up all your functions that you need. Like you need multicast, IGMP snooping, and to prevent all these difficult situations. Because once you get that flooding happening, the network probably goes down. You don't know where it's coming from, and troubleshooting it becomes really hard.
And it's intermittent and difficult to isolate. It's frustrating, right? It's maddening when you get into that type of scenario. It is so immensely frustrating.
Well, I actually, just to add to that, I actually have a network that I'm working on currently, and it's like 50 plus switches. And sometimes, yeah, some user in the building did something wrong, and we're now trying to troubleshoot it, what they did. But because it hasn't really been thought out in terms of what the users have access to, or when it's in its design phase, or now this network is still ongoing and being built. But if this would have happened while it's not ongoing and being built, this would have been a disaster. So it's really good for us that it happened now. It's a pain to go through it now, but at least we can address it and make sure that we don't have it happen again in the future. So this comes down to the same thing. It's always having the right things in place before it happens. But that doesn't always work, I think. It's not always like that.
Is this a great time to talk a little bit more about the trunk ports versus access ports and best practices there?
Yeah, I would say so. So maybe I can pick up the next example here. So now we talked a lot about switches and just general switches in general, but with NETGEAR, we have two features, right? We talked about trunks, what a trunk port is, and an access port. We didn't really touch on lags, but the lag allows the user to expand the bandwidth. So maybe we need to send 10 decoders or have 10 encoders send traffic across the network. We need to make sure that we have enough bandwidth. Now, with that also comes configurations and a lot of manual configurations that the user needs to do. But with NETGEAR, we have some really cool features. So on the left, you see, for instance, auto trunk. The two things that we need to take care of is the VLANs on the switch. So we configure the VLANs on the switch. Now we have a little piece of software that we've worked on very hard, which allows the user to configure those switches really quickly. And so it's not really from a switch perspective, but more from like an overall perspective where you configure your VLANs once, they go everywhere. We plug our two ports in between the switch. They get trunked automatically. So that means we send the VLANs across. And with adding more than one port on both switches, it also automatically creates a lag. So a lag allows us to have more throughput back and forth. And I would say this is definitely one of the biggest sellers for us because we as NETGEAR, we're very proud of what we've achieved in the time that we've been working in this space. And we've been touching on this a lot of times already, Jeff. It's where misconfiguration is probably also a big part of issues. And we try to reduce that misconfiguration, one, because a user might not always know how to do it. And two is just to make those things automatic. When it's automatic, it's just going to work.
Yeah. I did want to highlight something that I just observed myself here. This is not a trick. You are not being punked if you're watching this here today. I noticed that we labeled the video VLAN 20 and the Dante VLAN 20 in the illustration there. Those should have different numbers. This is not a trick. You would not have the same number on different VLANs.
That would work, actually.
Put that in different VLANs. So this is not a test. This is not a trick. That is a typo there as well.
We put that in there to see if we could trick you, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you. See if I was still paying attention to this part of the presentation. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, and there's one statement I want to make here as well, and one question that I want to ask. Again, not everybody watching this may have the same experience in networking. We may have some people watching this that have don't know still after watching the last 15, 20 minutes what the difference between a trunk port is and an access port is, and that's totally fine. Just engage the right people to have the right conversation. Michael, I know you and your team are more than happy to help your partners and customers have these conversations. I know Utelogy is always happy to be engaged in these conversations. Like it's always a much worse scenario to act as though you understand something or talk as though you understand a particular concept than to say, I don't know, but I'll get the right people involved that do know. And there's a lot of great, I know, Michael, you and your team have a phenomenal amount of knowledge and resources available and a strong desire to help. And we certainly do as well.
Yeah, and with that, I think your software complements the whole network. Our software complements the setup of the network, the setup of the switches, and I know not everybody that is watching is using NETGEAR, but the one of the I would say the biggest pain points in the move from traditional AV to AV over IP. Is it in meeting rooms or even just general like the entrance of a company where we have a nice large video wall? The configurations isn't that easy if you don't understand multicast, but that's where we try to make that easy. And maybe we can
Yeah, so
go to the next slide.
as we
And
start, I
or
think, wrapping up today's discussion, I think we've kept everything pretty generic, industry best practices, standards, that sort of stuff. But I would really like to make sure that we have a chance to highlight NETGEAR's, some of their specific solutions. And then, so Michael, I'll have you kick that off. And then Jeff, I'm going to go to you and give a little bit more of a plug for Utelogy solutions as well.
Mhm.
So,
thank you. Yeah.
yeah, let's talk about NETGEAR Plus a little bit.
So we talked a lot about multicast and what it does. If it's not correctly configured, it will broadcast and it floods the network, right? Again, as I was just saying before, it's not the easiest subject to work with. AV over IP is difficult, but on the left side, you could see that we just saw is when traffic is being transmitted over the network or from multicast on a traditional network, like a non-NETGEAR network, it's difficult to configure. We flood data across the network where it doesn't always need to be going. And on the right side, we can see NetGear's IGV Plus implementation. I won't go too deep in the technical terms, but as you can see, we have a transmitter on the left side, a receiver on the right side. And with our implementation, you set everything up, you configure your profile and your VLANs. We do our 4 VLANs. And once we do our video and audio in the right VLANs, then we don't have to do anything else except giving the switch IPs. If we send or request traffic from one encoder to a decoder, like we see here from transmitter 1 to receiver 4, that's the only traffic that we send across the network. So configuring a network with NETGEAR's switching that supports the AV UI, that supports Engaged, becomes really easy. Actually, Jeff, when we go to ISC, for instance, and some users actually just go there and come to us and they say, oh, you've made our life so much easier. And I'm not saying this to brag about our brand, but I think we listen to our customers and everything that we do is based on feedback. So everything that we implement is based on feedback, on requirements from our users. And I think that's really important. If you don't listen to your customers, it's not always that good because a lot of other brands might say, okay, this isn't conforming to the right standards or this packet isn't working very well because it isn't following the practices. We would probably help and try to solve it from our team. And I would say also what we've seen with Utelogy software is it becomes really easy to look into what we can do and where to troubleshoot, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Michael, let me, as an extension of that, let me ask you a question here. In transparency, so there's been some of these conversations that have taken place, and we finally get to a point with some customer, and they say, "Okay, right, we get it, right? We understand it. We get the values of doing this the right way and putting everything on the enterprise network, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." But then sometimes as like a final objection, we'll hear the statement of like, oh, we're a Cisco house, or we're an HPE Aruba house, or we only use networking equipment X, Y, or Z, right? I mean, here, just within the last 2 slides, you've shown a lot of value that, a NETGEAR environment can provide someone in terms of like auto trunking and auto lag and IGMP plus. And there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with NETGEAR. What would you say to somebody who's challenging that, who's saying, okay, we're only in do you have any lack of confidence in your ability to, get through the same InfoSec review that Cisco would go through or anything else?
Oh, thank you for asking, Jeff. And that's a really great question, actually, because I think that's probably one of the most important questions that we get very often. Is a combination. The IT team wants to have brand A. The AV team wants to have us because we have all these specific features. Sometimes getting those two things combined is hard for them. So we get into those conversations if they want. We can help them. NETGEAR and our hardware, we support the same functions that any other manufacturer does. We support all the open standards, and our engineering teams, every firmware version, we validate our code based on bugs, on seeing, okay, are there any vulnerabilities that are found? Do we have those vulnerabilities? Do we need to patch them? And before they come out, we ensure, or sorry, there are vulnerabilities that are sometimes discovered, and when we notice that these vulnerabilities are discovered, we address them straight away. So anything that's possible on a third-party switch, you can do the same on a NETGEAR switch, and maybe even a little bit better.
Yeah, wonderful.
Awesome.
Hopefully
And
that answers the question.
Yeah. Security is super important for us too, amongst other things. So if Jeff, you want to talk a little bit about Utelogy and our benefits.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, we're fortunate to be able to say that we have not met an InfoSec review that we haven't passed. Genuinely, I mean, I can look the camera in the eyes, if you will, and say that here today. It's something that we're very proud of, honestly, because everything that Utelogy does, and Michael, you touched on another thing as well, the voice of the customer and how much that impacts your product design, right? That's literally, we say that every day here at Utelogy. I mean, our customers, the voice of the customer and the feedback that we get from our customer base is what's driven probably over 80 to 90% of the new feature functionality that we introduce. Everything that we do is based on meeting the customer's needs and adding additional value into what they're doing on a daily basis, right? And so we take, security, we hold it in the very highest regard, right? I mean, being able to ensure that we're meeting the customer's security policies and posture, doing things in the most secure ways, leveraging secure protocols, encrypting things, using all the latest security mechanisms and algorithms. That's just a part of what we do, right? We've never gone through an InfoSec review that we've been concerned about or scared of or not wanting to participate in, and we take a great deal of pride in that. And what does that mean ultimately to the customer, right? What does all of this mean? Why are we here today having this conversation? What does this mean to someone who's using NETGEAR and Utelogy is, we want to reduce their mean time to resolution, and ultimately we want to give them time and money back, right? That's where really the rubber meets the road here. We want to be able to do things like automated testing. We want to be able to do things like self-healing and all these other things that come along as a part of the ride when we start to do things in an enterprise manner, right? And have visibility and connectivity all the way to the edge, right? And something that I say many times a day in virtually every meeting that I have is, if we haven't saved you more money than we've cost you, we haven't done our job right here at Utelogy. And that's my goal. My goal is to make our customers' lives, better, faster, easier, and to save them more money than they're spending on our solution to empower them even further. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think there's a few really great takeaways that we've had today. So when you're architecting your network and making sure you are having those tough conversations up front, making sure you're taking security in mind, everything becomes easier. You improve your uptime, your support efficiency improves, you're reducing all of those labor costs, your security posture improves, you're not worried about any InfoSec issues, and the AV and IT teams are working really closely together. That being said, I know you guys probably could have talked a lot more and a lot deeper about these conversations, and that there are a lot of other resources that anybody watching this can go to. So Michael, if you want to talk a little bit more about NETGEAR's resources, and where people can go to find those.
Yeah, so for not this is not just for AV, but for AV and IT, all our customers or users could go to academy.netgear.com. We have a level 1 AV training. Very soon we will be publishing our level 2 AV training. Our global training manager Gus is actually working on it very hard to get it done. We've been getting a lot of questions, but with that we also have wireless training, our insight training, our IT training. So it goes over how to configure a network from A to Z, and we go over all the requirements, doing radius and port security. And for our AV users, all the AV courses that we do, they're CTS accredited, so they could use that to renew their CTS, to acquire the CTS credits. So that's a really good addition to what we provide to our AV customers.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Jeff, I know Utelogy also does a lot of training about our platform. We have a lot of materials on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We fully welcome anyone with open arms that wants to learn more about Utelogy, whether you're current partner, customer, interested partner, customer. We're pretty open to that. But yeah, we've got a number of different outlets for training content. We've got some online on-demand content that you see referenced here. We also do a monthly instructor-led training as well that kind of takes a deeper dive into those concepts. So yeah, we're happy to, again, welcome you with open arms. Please feel free to reach out if you have any needs or questions, and we'd be happy to facilitate that.
Awesome. So as we wrap this up, I just wanted to thank both of you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jeff, so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Talking about all of this. I think it was a really fantastic session. We look forward to any more to come.